Hi all. Game 4 today. This was absolutely fascinating, very dramatic. These last two games have been a real contrast to the first two games. So let's see what happened in today's game. Vishy, playing white, played e4 and Magnus chose e5, so not a repeat of the Khan from an earlier round, but instead e5. After knight f3, knight c6, the Ruy Lopez Spanish game. Now knight f6, which is the Berlin Wall or Berlin defense. Now the Berlin defense in the year 2000, Vladimir Kramnik used this line as a drawing tool against Garry Kasparov in the classical World Chess Championship of 2000. Brain Games organised that match. In fact, I saw one or two of the games live, and it was remembered as the match which took Kasparov down. He couldn't really get any advantage against this Berlin Wall, and it's got massive popularity after that match, which Kramnik defeated Kasparov. So even players with dynamic styles like Shirov, Topalov, and Kasparov himself tried it after that match. So Kramnik really created this renaissance, and now White's castled. Let's get live book. Castling is the main move. Knight takes e4, d4. Now knight d6 is the main move, hitting the bishop and inviting basically an exchange of queens in the forcing sequence, which now ensues. So bishop takes c6, d takes e5, and we get this exchange of queens now. Very rarely do players avoid this with queen e2. There's like over 3,000 games taking a queen off. Queen e2 is only 40. Black's supposed to be absolutely fine after queen e2. The move knight d4, and black's absolutely fine. So following well-trodden theory, queen takes d8, king takes d8. So black has the bishop pair, but has structural damage. The king safety, you might think, isn't that a bit unsafe? With the queens off, it's not that unsafe. It's a very reliable system, this for black. We see the move h3 here. Now the most popular is actually knight c3, according to my live book, knight c3, or rook d1 check. So we see h3, it's a bit rarer. And now usually king e8 in this position is played, but we see bishop d7. And the word is that one of Magnus's seconds in this match, his friend Ludwig Hammer, who I saw play at the London Classic a few years ago. He mopped everyone up. Fantastic GM in his own right, and is on Magnus's team. Apparently he's played this. He's had one or two very good games with this bishop d7 move. Okay, so let's go back to live book here. Bishop d7. Now again, knight c3 here actually is very popular, but we see rook d1 pinning that bishop, and it looks as though there might be potentially actually a threat of e6 here. Let's turn on a Kibitzer. So is e6 actually threatened to exploit and punish the black king still being on d8? Well, Magnus invites actually e6 with bishop e7 if that is a threat. It's not such a big deal, and let's see why. So e6 would seem on the surface maybe dangerous, but just taking knight e5, black has the resource knight d6, closing up here and protecting f7, and it's not such a big deal. So that's not a big deal at all, even if white sacks here the exchange just to get the exchange. It's certainly not a big deal. Black's only going to be much better, in fact. This sort of position, black can actually play king c7 and be hugely better. So e6 is not such a major threat here. So it was just casually, bishop e7 was played. We see now knight c3, and white potentially has knight g5 now in this position. That f7 a little bit vulnerable. Black played actually king c8. So testing that g5 square a bit. If knight g5, let's have a look at that basic threat. What does black actually do here for f7? In fact, again, cleverly, well, black can actually just invite knight takes f7 with h6. So if knight takes f7, in this position, rook f8 forces now, the knight stranded, forces e6 actually. So it's not such a big deal. If the knight gets out like this, black is doing fine here. remember, black's always got this bishop pair, so it's usually not a big deal as long as he's not getting mated. He's got the double pawns, but even that, you know, this rook might be a problem sometimes. But usually, often, we see b6 and king b7 at some point. So anyway, king c8, so the king's heading to kind of crawl out soon. But at the moment, it's tied to d7. So this bishop g5 was played, which puts pressure on black. Now let's see a natural move. In this position, Magnus played h6. But let's see, b6, this b6 actually isn't a total disaster. Even b6 here, but white does seem comfortable with rook d3, with the idea just to try and get the rooks doubled really on that d7, on that d file. But actually, we see the move h6 being played by Magnus, so asking for an exchange of dark square bishops, and he doesn't mind relinquishing the bishop pair. So why is that? So bishop takes e7. What else? If bishop f4, it could be a target actually to things like g5 in the future potentially. It's not that big a deal. Black can carry on crawling out the position with b6. It's not offering that much of a challenge here. And actually, any g4s we've got knight h4, that bishop's actually useful for this mechanism of knight h4, which is another recurring kind of resource in these kind of positions for black. So it was whipped off. Bishop takes e7, whipping off the dark square bishop. Knight takes e7. Rook d2. Now getting on with getting this piece, getting all the pieces working on that d file, just coordinating. And now actually here is getting quite interesting. The question again is b6 okay? In fact, c5 was played. Is that a slight inaccuracy? If b6 was played here, it seems this is uncomfortable. If we have this position, it's a little bit on the uncomfortable side because of knight d4. So this knight d4 might be worth preventing. Even though black should survive this okay, it's not needed to allow this knight d4 resource. So in fact we see c5 first. And then, you know, black is still going to be playing b6 and put his king on b7 and connect the rooks finally. So we see rook a d1. So before the king can move, the bishop's got to get out of the way, bishop e6. And notably, it is eyeing this diagonal on that a2 pawn. Now watch out for that soon. We see now black actually also potentially putting pressure on e5, because that c5 move has vacated the c6 square. So the knight coming to c6 could add pressure to the e5 pawn. And you might consider also g5 later, even if black wants to try undermining you know, e5 later sometimes. So we see actually now a move which unblocks the f pawn. And also, so the knight's, even though it's coming back, it's going to come back in with a vengeance to d3 and maybe f4. And once we have f4, so unblocking the f pawn, we've got pawn mobility here. Pawns are the soul of chess, Philidor has said in the long distance past. Pawn mobility is the central undertone of many games here. So knight e1, preparing this advance of pawns, which in theory should be very dangerous for black. Now often in this opening, the f5 square is often a useful blockade square. And in terms of the f5 square, often h5 to try and prevent this, or even h5, h4 to try and seal white's pawns. But black's not really in a position to try and seal down the pawns here, I believe. Although, let's have a look. So, in game, we saw actually knight g6. So that is at least immediately preventing f4 as well as attacking e5. So knight d3 now. And here, b6. This is interesting now. So why doesn't white want to play a move like f4? Let's have a quick look. So f4, black's got the beautiful f5 square, blockade square, and can actually consider a move like h4. You might consider white, well, it's just to lock down these two pawns. If that h4 can be played, it starts to look like a Vladimir Kramnik game from the Brain Games match against Kasparov. So black, you know, positionally trying to blockade everything here, reduce the pawn mobility. to the absolute minimum. What does white actually do here? And this is the kind of position, if rook f1, we can inflict that blockade on f5 with, for example, knight h4. You can come back to f5 and h4, and we have a lockdown scenario. So that kind of scenario should really be avoided. And what we see now is a very, very interesting move then. In this position, what is white's plan? Because if black gets on with king b7, then it's kind of a threat. Black's getting on with it, and would it be that pleasant for white if if b3, for instance, king b7, black's got bishop f5 then on the cards as well. Okay, so Vishy wants to do something active, and we have on move 18 a very, very interesting move, knight e2. And the very observant may have noticed during the live transmission of the game here that the a2 pawn is on. But then this is a throwback to the classic Spassky versus Fischer game, where Fischer took a kind of poison pawn on h2 and miscalculated. It was because of a deep miscalculation. I don't believe a simple miscalculation. And the bishop was actually trappable. But here, is the bishop actually trappable? Well, Magnus tested that because he didn't believe it was in this particular situation. He did nab this pawn with bishop takes a2. Just one moment though, what was white's actual idea with this? Well, if he could play b3, then if the knight moves, maybe the knight's helping each other for f4, that sort of thing. The knight's also lending support for f4. If the knight on e2 supports f4 as well, we can get the pawn mobility going. So okay, knight e2, and it was indicated by Vishy, that at least, even though this is a bit dubious, it was consistent, and he couldn't actually see what was available in any case. What else was available? We don't want those pawn, restriction scenarios on the king side. So knight e2. So we have a very, very interesting game now. Not a quick draw today, just because there's a rest day tomorrow as well. No, it's going to be a very, very interesting game. How does white actually trap this bishop? Well, b3 now threatens to win the bishop with knight c3. So black has to play, it seems, is virtually forced to play c4 to try and break this bishop out. And it's hitting the knight. So white doesn't want to, of course, let the bishop out. So knight d to c1, just hitting the bishop like this. And now c takes b is showing that the bishop has another escape route on this diagonal, because now after c takes b, bishop b1. What's holding the bishop in now? The bishop's escaping on that diagonal. It's making a run for it. It's nabbed the pawn, and the bishop's making a run for it back into Magnus's position. White has gone a pawn down, and this is very, very dramatic. Okay, so we see now the move f4. At least white has pawn mobility though on the king side, and he's having to protect his e5 pawn. Black is actually threatening. Knight takes e5 in this position, so that is protected. Okay, now here we see king b7. So you might wonder, well, is bishop f5 possible immediately? Yes, that looks to be a plausible move, although knight g3 is a bit uncomfortable for black here. Where does the bishop go? If bishop e6, we've got f5. So Magnus actually wanted to preserve this light square bishop, and he's making way for the bishop to come to c8 with this move king b7. So the bishop can come like this to c8 now if needed. So we see knight c3 hitting the bishop. Now engines suggest actually, if white wants to justify this pawn sacrifice as a kind of positional pawn sacrifice, then maybe getting to d7 would be good without this light square bishop on. And in that regard, knight d3 is very interesting, because it's basically forcing the bishop to take the knight. And after rook takes d3, we're definitely getting an infiltration on d7. But the question has to be asked here, is this enough? So white's a pawn down, getting this infiltration. This kind of scenario, this is an engine variation from earlier. is actually, it's a slight advantage for black. It's interesting. We stopped, the lockdown with h4 by playing g3 here, and we could. Engines suggest this is only slightly advantageous because white's possession of that d file counts for something here. So very, very interesting scenario, just accepting being a pawn down here. But this wasn't used actually. We see actually after king b7 the move knight c3, letting the bishop go all the way back to c8 if needed. So we see bishop f5. Now the bishop's kicked, so we've got this pawn mobility, pawns of the solar chess, kicking things back. So the bishop goes all the way back now to c8. If it goes to e6 here, this is a bit trickier than before, this f5 idea actually, because knight takes e5 now threatens knight f3, and apparently this is just equal though, this position, after rook e2. So that's very interesting as well. It's very technical stuff that's not really needed. Magnus's idea is just to put the bishop on c8 here, and he's got a positional idea that as well as attacking f4, he wants to work on that f5 square. It's a delicious blockade square in this opening, and his rook's beautifully placed here, as well as this one actually for the past a pawn, but this one to try and undermine that f5 square with h5, liberating the rook and trying to wreck white's pawns or get that f5 square. So we see knight d3, h5. It looks a beautifully thematic move here. f5 now, and it is plausible for the knight to have come to h4, but it's more technical, it's more complex. There's potential for some issues which are not needed here with knight h4, although engines do suggest it may be in fact theoretically one of the most accurate moves. But this is not bad either. Knight e7, so knight just going to e7. Now we see knight b5, so the knight going into enemy territory here, past that fourth rank. It's got evil intentions on c7 here. The rooks can potentially come to c1 or c2 to add support to attacking the c7 pawn. And in fact here, things get a bit crazy. There's some puzzles coming up now. Because now, after h takes g4, instead of the automatic recapture which was played here, there's some absolutely beautiful variations which really make games worth annotating. You can find these beautiful resources that exist in the game, and apparently Boris Gelfand was checking this game out, and he made this suggestion here, rook c1, which engines actually quite like, as well as hg4, just rook c1 or rook c2 is another kind of engine suggestion. There might be a slight finesse in using rook c2 as well here, a tiny finesse. But let's have a quick look at rook c1. So white just ignoring that pawn loss and just going for c7, and it's actually really quite tricky here how black would defend this. And it's quite amazing that if you think Vishy Anand analysed this position and had to find the very, very best defence here to try and rule out this aggressive use of not automatically recapturing, and he considered knight d5 to be satisfactory for black. If here e6, this starts to get quite dangerous though, this variation with knight e5 now, and here this other knight, they're up to great mischief, these knights now, very evil knights here. And just to demonstrate that, there's a very evil threat here. Whoops, I think I might have highlighted it. But let's give black a move which doesn't do anything about it. Say black was oblivious to that. G takes h3. We would have a beautiful rook sacrifice. Rook takes c7 check. Is actually mating the black king, because if king b8 here, we have knight c6, so this is a nice puzzle position actually, and if king a6, then we have rook a2 mating, so these knights can be really up to great mischief in this position. And this was one of the beautiful variations demonstrated by Boris Gelfand. But the thing is, Vishy saw a defence here which is quite right actually, that black can bypass this and survive with a5, shutting down the use of the a file for mating the black king. So this doesn't work now. Rook takes c7, either just taking or just even king a6 and White's just losing this. He's falling apart now. There's no attack to justify this. B5 is hanging, H3 is hanging. You know, the knight's threatening. There's all sorts of threats there. So that rules out, in fact, Rook C1. But there might have been a slight finesse on the Rook C2 move here as well. A tiny finesse, which might be worth exploring. It seems White has a slightly different way of doing things here with knight b4. So another intriguing thing here. Very intriguing forcing move. This kind of scenario. So if king a6, it all gets pretty complicated actually. But it doesn't look as though here that there's a clear mate anyway. But very, very, very technical stuff to try and get at Black's king instead of playing the routine capture on g4 here. So Rook c1, beautiful variations pointed out by Boris Gelfand. Some interesting stuff. If you might be wondering though, what about instead of there's an idea in one of the lines of defending c7. Let's go back to Rook c1. If knight c6, this would have been trouble. This just shows knight d5 was virtually the only way. White could double up rooks, and it shows that there is potential trouble here on that c file. And again, this knight b4 resource shows its head for being very, very dangerous actually. If taking White's winning here actually with this knight d6, and again there's this kind of mating net woven against the black king. So that kind of disaster should be avoided. But this is all kind of considered, and we get this routine, what seemed to be a routine recapture of the pawn here. But it had to be considered, you know, that advanced knights always put pressure on position. Usually it's good to kick them back if they go into your territory. So that's a very, very dangerous knight here. So we see H takes g4. So that's at move 28. Bit of tea. One moment. Okay. So we see now Rook h4. So Magnus is trying to chip away at these pawns. That g pawn is protected with knight f2. Knight f2, and now we see knight c6, asking the e5 pawn what it's going to do. But now we see the wrath of the c file. Instead of defending e5, we see rook c2 now. So if knight takes e5, let's have a look at the obvious knight takes e5. Again, we don't want this sort of disaster. If king a6, knight c3, and again, king safety has now reached critical levels. So no, that's not the way to play this position. Here we see a5 being played, which is one of the best moves in the position. It might have been plausible to add support to the knight on c6 by playing rook h6. If doubling here, this gets a bit scary for black actually. The pressure is quite large on that c file in this scenario. So knight d4, and apparently black's like surviving this kind of scenario. It looks just very, very scary. But let's go with what Magnus played. So after rook c2 here, so he's faced with the rooks being doubled. He does play a5. It's got a longer term goal that maybe, you know, he's liberating the rook as well. He's providing some king safety in the short run as well. And engines really, really like this move a5. It's like one of the most super accurate. Even at depth 21, it's like a5 comes out of Houdini. It's like a fantastic move in the circumstance for defending against these threats on the c file. Okay, so now, you know, black is still a pawn up, technically with a significant advantage, more than half a pawn's worth of advantage. Now, what is actually black threatening now to improve his position? Magnus might actually indeed be threatening a4 just to extend the scope of the rook. Also, g6 just to undermine the pawn chain is another idea. Or rook h8 and then a4 just to connect the rooks potentially. But we see rook c4, which at least addresses the a4 threat. It keeps the locking key over a4. It also adds support for g4. Again, you know, this pawn really can't be taken because of that c7. That would just be horrible. So we see g6, Magnus chipping away at this pawn chain again. And of course, this rook on h4 now threatens to take on c4, and then we can take on e5. Once we get rid of this rook, this attacking rook, glaring down at c7, we'll be safe to take on e5. So what to do? Well, the pressure is put more on the c file with the doubling of the rooks. Rook dc1, doubling the rooks. So now what to do about c6? It's protected with bishop d7 here. Was there another method instead of rook dc1? Just briefly, if e6, this looks quite dangerous as well, and this was mentioned by Vishy as one of the things he wanted to try and get working. And there's a really different property of the position being expressed here, that white is actually creating a very dangerous passed pawn in this scenario. After f takes g, this pawn is only 2 steps away, but Vishy couldn't find a way of getting this queening because he sees the resource either e5 or rook h6, just fending against this passed pawn threat. Either will do here. If rook h6, and he thought that black was winning here. If we try and double, by the way, just bishop d7, and then there's no problem there. So we're going to collect that pawn, there's no problem. So that rook's going to get behind that pawn on g7, just rook g7. But there was another very, very beautiful concept here, which is worth showing after e5, which may not be as good as rook h6. And the beautiful concept was actually rook. This is unbelievable, but to try and get this pawn queening, we have another virtual puzzle, which was now demonstrated by Vishy. Rook d8, and the idea here is quite amazing, that if knight takes, we play rook takes c7 check, and if king b8, that would actually be losing because of rook takes c8, and then g7 actually queening the pawn. Black's absolutely helpless there. But unfortunately, Vishy also saw in this variation there's a slight snag here because black has king a6, and this is absolutely winning for black instead. How does white actually queen the pawn here? If g7, we have bishop e6 now. So he had a look at this very, very interesting, you know, dynamic stuff, it seems, but came to the conclusion just rook, you know, in this position, rook dc1. So we see bishop d7. So there's a lot of stormy complications being checked out behind the scenes here, and we get a kind of simple chess being played on the actual board at the moment. But even this seems really quite dangerous for c6, and e6 is used here to try and distract the bishop from protecting c6. F takes, and we have another dangerous pawn here, only 2 steps away, bishop e8. And now here at move 35 we have an absolutely enormously powerful move, and you need to check, you know, with Houdini at depth 22 for it to come up with this idea. It's like a nice little positional sacrifice. It's amazing. Accuracy of some of these moves is absolutely incredible. Because what is actually black threatening? If white doesn't do something active, then maybe to consolidate the position a bit more with rook h7 to secure c7, and then maybe to get on with stuff after that. So white has to have something active, and he finds a really active move, which many of us I don't think would have considered. In fact, I'm curious, would any of you find this move if I gave you 10 seconds here and you haven't seen this game before? If I give you 10 seconds here, you might want to pause the video. White to play and start to put pressure on black with dynamic play. Okay, it looks like a blunder. Knight e4. Looks as though, hold on, that knight was protecting g4, the rook was protecting g4, none of them are protecting g4 now, and it's with check as well? Well, Vishy is prepared to get his king up the board. The closer we get to endgames, the more we have to try and use all our pieces. Even the king can be a fighting piece. So rook takes g4, king f2. The king comes up the board with this pawn sacrifice. So rook f4 check is played here. What else does Magnus do? His pieces are a bit stuck here. He can't even play a4. He's been locked out of that. What does it actually he do here? What can he do? The king's coming to e3. For example, if rook, rook d8 might be one of the better moves in the position, but the king coming to e3 would mean that white's potentially threatening all sorts of things like knight f6 or even knight d6 check to be able to take off this e8 bishop and take on c6. That's the undermining operation, very tactical, to win that bishop, then take on c6 here. So we see rook f4 check. Sorry, but there's an immediately obvious threat as well. Not just taking on e8, just to win the rook here. This rook is now loose on g4. So something has to be done about knight ed6 check immediately in this position. If we just check out why this was defending against knight d6, if knight d6 here, c takes, rook takes g4. Apparently this is okay for black, because now hitting the rook and hitting this knight is actually very, very good for black. So that was actually an available defense in this position, to play rook d8 here. So rook f4 check though was played, and we see king e3. So now rook f4 does stop at least the knight f6, but we still have this technical idea knight d6 check could be a resource at some point, but for the moment the rook either has to move or be protected. g5 might have been a viable move here to try and keep black with a slight advantage in this position. In fact, the advantage of black has slightly shrunk already, so like less than half a pawn. If for one moment, let's just briefly hold on a sec. Is rook d8 retaining like more than half a pawn for some reason, because of this tactical idea of knight e5 attacking g4 and b5? How does actually white play this here? If he plays king e3, so let's not go with knight d6, trying to win the rook. King e3, rook d5. Maybe, technically this was a more accurate method of play for black. But okay, so we'll go through the game sequence. Check. And now rook f8 was played instead of g5, and apparently now, from a technical point of view, at this moment it's dead level, the position. Black could have black apparently is equal now, so it seems Magnus has somehow messed up his tiny advantage. So we see knight d4, and black takes on d4. Rook takes c7, king a6, king takes d4. So we're back to just being one pawn down for white. So temporarily white was 2 pawns down after knight d4, but what else could black have done here? The pressure on c6 is just enormous. There's only bishop on e8. Knight b4, I mean, is another idea maybe, but knight takes d4, so we're still just 1 pawn down. Check. And now king c3 was played, which seems natural to try and look after the b3 pawn in this position, but maybe even king e3 might actually be okay for white apparently. But king c3 was played. Check. King b2. Now rook e3, the rook's trying to get behind this dangerous pass pawn. Nimzovich has said pass pawns are criminals, they should be kept under lock and key. So we see now rook c8. Rook. Now Magnus doesn't want to exchange off rooks here. He wants to preserve the slightest of winning chances. If he took the rook here, then this exchange is actually leading to a position which is going to be quite easy to draw. Once these interesting pawns are removed from the position and we're just left with 2-1 here, it'll be very, very simple to draw that in principle. So this kind of scenario where the interesting pawns, the king has to be stopped from using b4, But this kind of scenario will be dead drawn. So Magnus is preserving both of his rooks now by playing rook d3. So threatening rook takes b3 check as well. He's preserving a little bit in the game here. So a check is thrown in. Maybe it wasn't strictly necessary, but Vishy was actually very short of time at various points in this endgame, and he liked the idea of throwing in a check just to get another move in, and then doing a move, as long as it was pretty safe to do so, just to try and get to the time controls needed. So rook takes e4. Very interesting. So these pawns are making a big difference. White's king safety might be called into question though as well. e7. Rook g3. White plays now rook c3. Check. Rook c2. And Magnus again refusing any exchange of rooks, of course. Rook e3. Technically this is equal. King a2, g5. But White has to be careful. Rook d2. Rook e5. Rook d7 check. Now here there's a disaster scenario. If the king had gone on move 51 to a6, then check here is actually winning for White, because rook d5 check now. Ouch. That's winning the rook, because that pawn's queening. So Magnus had to play king c6. And we see now rook e d8. So White's threatening now a check, and then also on d5. Rook ge3. We see check. Now the king goes back to b7. So if it goes to c5, say, very interesting finesses here. Actually, in this position, White can come to the, as long as the interesting pawns can be removed to leave that scenario of the 2-1 here, this should be much more easy to draw, and White can absolutely force that scenario by queening here. So after rook takes, playing this check, after king b4, kicking the king back, because it doesn't want to help the rook on the 7th here. The king is kicked back, and if it goes back here now, then we take on e8 first, and then we take on g5, and that's a dead draw. So this kind of scenario has to be avoided if Magnus wants to preserve any winning chances in this rook and pawn ending. So rook d6, he played king b7. So that's the kind of reasoning behind, I think, king b7. This is a powerful idea to very simply draw there. So it was avoided with king b7, which unbelievably, creates some risk factor for Vishy to potentially lose this. He's very short time. He's only got a couple of minutes or less. Check. King a6 now. Rook d5, and it seems to be, plain sailing. We're going to get rid of the interesting pawns here, surely. Draw, So check, king a3. But now we get a really naughty move, move 56, and I think Vishy only had about a minute and a half now, and this sets a shocker up in this position. And this is one of the reasons why don't trust anyone about endings being memorized or something, as though GMs have this repertoire of endings. They need to be calculated, because each position has very fine resources sometimes, not just involving queening pawns, but also king safety. I think John Nunn, one of Britain's finest grandmasters, has done books on dynamic endgames. And in this position, Magnus plays the really naughty rook e6. And I wonder if you can spot why this is a vicious trap here. So at move 56, I'll show you. If rook takes g5, what does black play here to win? If I gave you 10 seconds in this position, starting from now. Okay, black would have b5, and it's actually mating white or forcing white to give up a rook because of this threat of b4. This is very, very naughty stuff. There's no checks or anything for the black king here. So, for example, giving up the rook is not ideal. That's just hopeless. Black would be just a rook up and taking on e7. So that would be a very nasty trap to play. So Vishy has to keep his cool here. He plays actually rook d8. So why does this prevent this b5 idea, you might ask? In the game we saw g4. Now if b5 is tried here, it's prevented, the naughty idea is prevented because of rook a8 check. If king b6, check. If king c6, we do, for example, rook d takes b5, or even rook b takes d5, and b takes b5, or rook d takes b5, and this is fine for white. We've got rid of the interesting pawns, and white's not being mated as a bonus here, so that's fine. So Magnus, after rook d8 in this position, he can't go with b5. So just to recap, b5 we got the check. So he goes with g4. And now Vishy plays rook g5. He's trying to get rid of the interesting pawns still. And one of them is now coming off, the e7 one. Can he take on g4 though? This is a risk factor at move 59. If he casually takes on g4, it might not be that brilliant here. And you might ask why? Why this finesse? Why can't we take on g4? The thing is, we'd be in perilous danger if we take on g4 because of king... the potential for the king to come to b5 to help things. For example, rook f2, and black is actually threatening to mate white again. What does actually white do about this? It may be actually that this can be parried though with check and rook g5. So actually it's not too scary as you might imagine. Okay, but first the check. Instead of taking the pawn immediately, we see the check first on a8. And now the rook usefully comes to strengthen the idea of capturing on g4. So without the king being so aggressive there. We see Magnus now trying a4. This is a last little trap. It's been quite naughty here. I think if b takes... is it a trap? No, not really actually, because check... this is not winning for black either. This is apparently this is okay, but Vishy doesn't mind this b3 pawn being captured. Rook takes g4 was played. After a takes, now rook g7 gets rid of a pair of rooks by force. So there's nothing that can be done here for black. If b2 we just take on e7 here. If this was played we just take on e7, then we take on b2. So there's no nasty. This is very easy to draw. So Magnus in this position played king a6. And now we saw one pair of rooks coming off and king takes b3. And at move 64, the number of squares on the chessboard, finally the game was agreed drawn. Now this was, I think, one of the most exciting, dramatic games of the match, one of the largest. It took quite a long time just to do the notes for this game before showing you that, trying to demonstrate the variations here. Huge game, fascinating, and the finesses of this rook and pawn ending. There are many which may not have been shown here, but so this is a little bit of a brief overview of this game. I hope you enjoyed it. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much. We're 2-2 now, I think. After 4 games, 4 draws. The first 2 draws. Not so exciting, but the last 2 certainly very, very exciting. So the match is now truly alive.